Europe and the United States are major destinations for the world's immigrants. In both places, debates about immigration policy have focused on what to do with unauthorized immigrants. Welcome to Rick's Europe, Andrew Hammel, lawyer and journalist.
Thank you.
You were on the show a few weeks ago and you gave us some insights on the migration policies in Germany, the problems they've been facing with distributing migrants and fundings to uphold and house a large influx of people coming into the country. And you've seen the developments of migration in Europe, said to be with good intentions, but there's been a lot of trouble regulating migration and the consequences are many. Could you give us your take on why you think things have developed the way they have in countries like Sweden, Ireland, and of course, Germany?
Sure. These are, first of all, these are all Northwestern European countries or Western European countries. And as I pointed out a little while ago on my Twitter feed, what you see is a tendency for almost all immigrants who enter Europe at the outer borders to eventually migrate northwest to richer countries like Germany, like Sweden, Ireland, not so much, but Ireland is now finding out that if you're an EU member, then you must accept a certain number of immigrants assigned to you. And the reason for that is basically that in countries in the southern European periphery, there just isn't enough money and not enough political will to actually provide housing and welfare benefits and education and language classes to these new arrivals who usually come in through the asylum system. But Germany and Sweden, for instance, take their responsibilities seriously, and they actually do provide fairly generous benefits and housing and education. And so you see there are, of course, lots of authorized immigrants who come in legally, but the ones who come in under the European asylum system, they tend not to stay long term in countries like Italy or Spain or France because they're going to have to live on the street because there simply isn't enough money to provide for them. And so they generally migrate up to Northwestern Europe. This is not supposed to happen under EU law. Under EU law, they're supposed to stay where they first entered the EU, but that system called Dublin III, it broke down a long time ago.
And you were giving some interesting insights about the differences between the way migration is handled in Europe versus countries like the US or Australia. What are the key factors or the key differences between the handlings of the two different continents? And of course, the English-speaking language can be a factor as well. But what would you say are the key factors?
There's a number of them. First of all, immigrant societies like Australia and the USA just tend to be a bit more welcoming. Their cultures are more thin and easier to get to know. And the English language priority is also a priority for immigrants because most of them speak that. But the key thing is that, especially if you look at Canada and the United States, when you set aside the problem of illegal immigration, which is, a big issue in the USA, legal immigrants are screened and vetted and, their background is checked. They're given health checks. They have to satisfy a score on a point system that demonstrates that they are likely to settle down and contribute to the economy and find work, basically from the very get-go. And that attracts a much more educated and much more cosmopolitan set of migrants to places like the USA and Canada because immigrants are largely chosen based upon their particular skill sets and education. And so you have, one interesting statistic is that immigrants from India to the United States are drastically more successful than white European Americans. They have an average annual income twice that of ordinary white Americans, such as myself. And you see that for lots and lots of immigrant subgroups in the USA. The USA basically gets the immigrants with the most human capital, and then comes Canada, and then come Australia. Whereas in Europe, European countries still have not adopted a point system for screening immigrants. Germany is just now debating that point system, but it was taboo for many, many years. And most European countries still do not have an organized nationwide system for screening, so for positive screening to attract the people who are most likely to settle down and contribute to European societies. They're beginning to do this just now, but it's very, very late. So a lot of immigration is still done under the asylum system in Europe, which has no quality controls and no background checks, and no way of ensuring that the people who are let into the country are a good long-term fit for places like Sweden and Germany.
And what do you think? You were mentioning a few things, but what do you think should change to improve the situations in a lot of these European countries? I mean, how can segregation be avoided in the future?
That is a question that all European countries are facing now because almost all of them have some problem with ghettoized immigrant communities, as they say, or, you could say no-go areas, but I don't really like that language, but sort of parallel societies that have emerged. Germany has less of a problem here. It's been actually pretty successful there, but most other European countries do. And the thing is, you can't prevent these parallel societies from occurring because they already have occurred in most European countries. There are areas that are just basically dominated by immigrants from the Middle East and North African nations. Going forward, the EU has finally begun to take the issue seriously. So they just agreed at the EU level on a pact for reforming migration at the EU level. And it includes things like doing asylum checks at the border of the European Union. And the EU itself is now going to negotiate with countries of origin like Cameroon or Nigeria or Sudan and basically force them to take back unsuccessful asylum claimants. But first of all, this system has not been worked out in the details yet. It's just a statement of principles. And nothing will come into effect for 2 more years, which means probably another 2 or 3 million immigrants will come into Europe during that time under the present system. And also, once specifics are worked out, there will be innumerable court challenges to what the EU imposes, going up to the EU courts and also the European Court of Human Rights, which, although it's not an EU court, it can reject national policies that are based on EU agreements. And the European Court of Human Rights has especially been very activist in basically creating a system in which it is almost impossible to reject asylum seekers who appear at the border and to deport them once they enter the country. And so reform is just beginning. It's a long way off, and NGOs and lawyers are going to fight it every step of the way in front of judges who are very sympathetic. So I'm optimistic long term because this system simply has to change. But in the short term, it's going to be a long, hard slog to get to some kind of realistic, effective, pragmatic immigration policy in Europe.
Thank you, Andrew Hammel, lawyer and journalist.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.